There's a peculiar truth about war that most people never consider. Sometimes the greatest deterrent isn't the ability to win, but the ability to make victory so costly that no rational adversary would attempt it. It's the logic of the porcupine, a small creature that doesn't chase predators, doesn't claim vast territories, doesn't roar or intimidate. It simply makes itself impossible to swallow. And today, on an island barely 100 miles from the shores of a superpower, 23 million people are betting their survival on this ancient principle. Taiwan exists in a state of permanent paradox. Walk through the neon-lit streets of Taipei, and you'll find a thriving democracy, night markets buzzing with energy, technology campuses where the world's most advanced semiconductors are designed. Young professionals sip coffee in minimalist cafes, debating politics with a freedom that would be unthinkable across the strait. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy lies an existential reality. Taiwan is claimed by the People's Republic of China, a nuclear-armed nation of 1.4 billion people whose government has never renounced the use of force to achieve what it calls reunification. The Taiwan Strait is both moat and choke point, a geographic buffer that has protected the island for decades but could be crossed in hours by a determined military force. This contradiction, prosperity shadowed by threat, democracy flourishing under the specter of invasion, creates a psychological phenomenon known as normalcy bias. It's the human tendency to assume that because disaster hasn't struck yet, it won't strike at all. Taiwanese citizens live technologically advanced lives, plan careers, raise children, invest in real estate, all while an existential threat looms just beyond the horizon. This compartmentalization isn't denial, it's adaptation. The mind can only sustain high alert for so long before it must either collapse or normalize the abnormal. But beneath this surface calm, military planners on both sides of the strait are playing out scenarios that could reshape the entire Indo-Pacific. And Taiwan's answer to overwhelming force is deceptively simple, become impossible to swallow. The problem Taiwan faces is one of radical asymmetry. Since the 1990s, the People's Liberation Army has undergone a transformation unprecedented in modern military history. Aircraft carriers now patrol waters once dominated by American naval power. Fifth-generation stealth fighters compete with anything in Western arsenals. Missile systems capable of striking targets across the Pacific have proliferated along China's coast. The PLA's modernization has been methodical, expensive, and relentless, driven by a clear strategic vision. Create the capability to take Taiwan by force if political reunification proves impossible. Taiwan's military, by contrast, has struggled with the weight of its own legacy. For decades, it maintained a Cold War posture built around prestige platforms, F-16 fighters, destroyers, advanced radar systems, designed to signal strength rather than actually fight a war. Conscription became largely symbolic, reduced to 4 months of service that most middle-class families viewed as a waste of time, a box to check before entering the workforce. The island's best technical minds gravitated not toward military careers, but toward the semiconductor industry, where salaries were higher and the work more prestigious. Defense spending hovered around 2.5% of GDP, a percentage that sounds reasonable until you realize China's absolute numbers dwarf Taiwan's by orders of magnitude. The wake-up call came not from the Taiwan Strait, but from Eastern Europe. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, military analysts worldwide watched with intense focus. What they saw confirmed suspicions that had been building for years. Modern warfare had fundamentally changed. Ukraine didn't stop Russian columns with tanks and fighter jets. It stopped them with anti-ship missiles sinking the Moskva, with Turkish-made drones destroying supply convoys, with mobile infantry teams armed with javelins turning expensive armored vehicles into burning wrecks. The lesson was stark. In asymmetric conflict, what matters more than hardware, and cheap precision weapons deployed by motivated defenders can neutralize billion-dollar platforms. Taiwan strategists recognized themselves in Ukraine's predicament, a smaller nation facing a much larger adversary, unable to match conventional military strength, yet possessing advantages that could be leveraged: defensive terrain, motivated population, and the potential for international support. But Ukraine also revealed a harder truth. Help comes in the form of weapons and intelligence, not troops. If Taiwan were invaded, it would fight alone, at least initially. The question became, how do you design a military capable of surviving long enough for help to matter? The answer has historical precedents, though each must be understood in its specific context. In the Winter War of 1939, Finland faced the Soviet Union's massive invasion with a tiny army that should have been crushed in weeks. Instead, Finnish forces used intimate knowledge of terrain, extreme mobility, and acceptance of casualties to bleed the Red Army across frozen forests. The Soviets eventually prevailed through sheer attrition, but the cost was so high, hundreds of thousands of casualties, international humiliation, that Stalin's strategic calculus shifted. Finland survived not by winning, but by making victory Pyrrhic. Switzerland's Cold War doctrine took the concept further. The entire society was militarized, with every bridge wired for demolition, every mountain pass prepared for defense, every adult trained for civil resistance. The Swiss didn't expect to defeat a Soviet invasion. They expected to make occupation so costly, so prolonged, so bloody that the rational choice would be to invade elsewhere. It was deterrence through promised misery. Israel's evolution offers a different model. In early wars, Israel relied on tank formations and decisive maneuver warfare, seeking quick victories before international pressure could force ceasefires. But as threats evolved, rockets from Gaza and Lebanon, insurgencies in occupied territories, Israel shifted towards systems like Iron Dome. The goal wasn't to eliminate threats, but to impose costs, make each rocket launch expensive, each tunnel complex vulnerable, each attack a net loss for the adversary. It's deterrence through economics, a calculus of pain that makes continued aggression irrational. These examples share a philosophical foundation, making aggression irrational through cost inflation rather than seeking military victory. It's a defensive psychology that requires accepting uncomfortable truths. You cannot win in the traditional sense. You cannot march on the enemy's capital or dictate peace terms. Your goal is narrower and paradoxically harder. Prevent the adversary from winning quickly or cheaply enough to make the attempt worthwhile. It's the logic of raising the price until even a superpower decides the purchase isn't worth it. This is where the porcupine metaphor crystallizes. A porcupine doesn't hunt. It doesn't expand territory. It doesn't need to be faster or stronger than predators. It only needs quills, thousands of sharp, painful deterrents that make every attack a cost-benefit calculation. For Taiwan, this meant a conceptual revolution that began in the mid-2010s. Instead of trying to control the air and sea around the island, an impossible task against China's growing military, Taiwan would focus on denying those domains to an invasion force. The shift was from aspiring to dominance to embracing denial. American think tanks like SIZE and RAND contributed intellectual frameworks, running simulations that showed Taiwan's expensive fighters and ships would be destroyed in the opening hours of conflict. What might survive were dispersed, mobile systems, missile launchers hidden in commercial buildings, coastal caves, or moved constantly on trucks. Indigenous Taiwanese reformers pushed for procurement changes, favoring mass-produced systems over exquisite platforms. The strategy coalesced around 5 core principles: mobile distributed forces that couldn't be destroyed in a first strike, affordable systems that could be produced in large numbers, coastal defense primacy focused on destroying an invasion fleet in the strait itself, resilient command and control that could survive decapitation attempts, and whole-of-society resistance that would continue even if the government fell. But strategy on paper is one thing. Implementation requires transforming a military culture, an industrial base, and, most difficult of all, a society that has grown comfortable with peace. The weapons themselves tell the story of this transformation. Taiwan's missile arsenal has become the centerpiece of its defense, a collection of systems designed with singular purpose, sinking ships and destroying aircraft before they can deliver an invasion force. The Sungfeng series, indigenous anti-ship missiles, are hidden across the island's western coast facing China. Some sit in caves carved into cliffs. Others are mounted on commercial trucks that look ordinary until launcher tubes elevate. A few are reportedly placed in urban buildings, camouflaged among Taipei's dense skyline. The logic is proliferation through concealment. China cannot target what it cannot find, and even comprehensive strikes cannot guarantee destruction of a dispersed arsenal. Naval mines add another layer. Modern bottom-rising mines sit dormant on the seabed until triggered by specific acoustic or magnetic signatures. They're cheap to produce, difficult to detect, and catastrophic when encountered. Taiwan could turn the strait into a minefield, forcing China to choose between protecting its invasion fleet or accepting losses that would sink troop transports and supply ships critical to any amphibious operation. The mine threat creates a temporal advantage. Clearing them takes time, and time is Taiwan's most valuable resource. Air defense follows the same layering principle. Patriot systems provide high-altitude coverage against ballistic missiles and aircraft. Indigenous Tian-Kung systems fill medium ranges. Shorter-range systems like TORs create overlapping zones of lethality. The goal isn't to shoot down every Chinese missile, an impossible task, but to force the PLA to expend expensive precision munitions on dispersed, less valuable targets. Each Patriot interceptor costs roughly $3 million. Each Chinese ballistic missile costs even more. The economic logic of attrition warfare favors the defender who can impose costs without matching capabilities. This is where cost-exchange ratios become decisive. A $2 million anti-ship missile can sink a $2 billion destroyer. 10 drones costing $50,000 total can disable an airfield servicing $100 million fighters. The math doesn't require equal spending, only smart spending that maximizes pain per dollar invested. Taiwan cannot outproduce China's industrial base, but it can make every attempted landing so expensive in ships, aircraft, and lives that even China's vast resources become strained. Drones represent the democratization of this principle. Ukraine showed that commercial quadcopters modified with grenades could destroy tanks costing millions. Taiwan's technology sector, accustomed to rapid prototyping, miniaturization, and mass production, has pivoted toward military drones with impressive speed. Reconnaissance drones provide intelligence without risking pilots. Kamikaze drones strike landing craft and helicopters. Swarm tactics overwhelm defenses through numbers rather than sophistication. There's a cultural dimension here too. A generation raised on video games experiences less psychological resistance to remote warfare than to close combat. The drone operator in a bunker is less traumatized than the infantryman in a trench, a reality that matters when sustaining morale over weeks or months of fighting. Geography reinforces these advantages. Taiwan's coastline offers only 13 beaches suitable for large-scale amphibious landings. Each is known, surveyed, and prepared. Artillery positions pre-sighted on exact coordinates. Demolition charges placed on bridges and tunnels leading inland. Urban areas behind potential landing zones transformed into layered defenses where every building could become a strongpoint. The island's interior is 70% mountainous, terrain that historically favors defenders and makes mechanized warfare difficult. An invasion wouldn't end at the beach. It would continue through cities and mountains where numerical superiority matters less than knowledge of terrain. The historical comparison that haunts Chinese planners is D-Day. The Normandy invasion required total air superiority, months of logistical preparation, extensive deception operations, and still resulted in heavy Allied casualties on beaches where German defenses were undermined by years of strategic bombing and resistance activity. Taiwan presents a far harder problem. The strait is wider than the English Channel. Taiwan's defenses would be alerted from the moment Chinese ships left port. There are no European resistance movements to sabotage from within. Most critically, China has never conducted an amphibious operation at the scale required, and the PLA has not fought a major war since a brief, unsuccessful invasion of Vietnam in 1979. Amphibious assaults are among the most complex military operations, requiring precise coordination across naval, air, and ground forces under fire. Failure would not just lose equipment, it would shatter the regime's image of competence. Taiwan's industrial base faces a different challenge. Domestic shipyards are attempting to build submarines, a capability that would add another dimension to strait defense. Missile production is scaling up, but supply chains remain vulnerable. Many components come from the United States or Europe, meaning stockpiles become critical. In a blockade scenario, Taiwan couldn't resupply. Every weapon must be in place before conflict begins. The semiconductor industry adds a paradoxical element. Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company produces the majority of the world's advanced chips. Every iPhone, Every AI server, every modern weapon system relies on TSMC's fabrication plants concentrated in Hsinchu and Tainan. This concentration makes them both a vulnerability and a strategic asset. China might calculate that destroying TSMC would cripple the global economy, including its own. Alternatively, China might believe the world's dependency means Taiwan cannot be defended without risking economic collapse. The chips become both shield and target, a wild card in deterrence calculus that nobody fully understands. Yet weapons are only as effective as the people who wield them. And here Taiwan faces perhaps its greatest challenge: transforming a society that has known only prosperity and freedom into one willing to endure siege and sacrifice. Conscription reveals this tension most clearly. For years, Taiwan's mandatory service was 4 months, a period so brief that meaningful military training was impossible. It became a rite of passage, something to endure and forget. Middle-class families developed avoidance strategies: graduate school, medical deferments, connections to soft assignments. The entire system reflected a society that had conceptually moved past war, treating defense as a diplomatic problem rather than a physical one. In 2024, Taiwan extended mandatory service to 1 year and modernized training curricula. Instead of parade drills and lectures, conscripts now learn urban combat, anti-armor tactics, drone operation, skills relevant to the defense scenarios they might actually face. The reform met resistance predictable in any democracy. Parents worried about lost career momentum for children entering a competitive job market. Technology companies complained about delayed workforce entry. Generational divides emerged, with older citizens who remembered martial law often more supportive than young people who had only known freedom. Comparative examples are illuminating but not directly applicable. South Korea's 18 to 21-month service is normalized through decades of practice and an active threat from North Korea. Military service is integrated into life planning. Employers expect it, families accept it. Singapore's 2-year conscription plus reservist obligations functions as civic duty in a small, vulnerable city-state where defense is understood as existential. Israel's gender-equal conscription is woven into national identity, where military service provides social networks, career opportunities, and a shared experience that binds a fractious society. Taiwan lacks this cultural foundation. Conscription was always someone else's problem, something that happened to other people's children. The behavioral economics question cuts deeper. Will Taiwan's youth actually fight? Surveys show high abstract support for defending the island. Over 70% express willingness to resist invasion. But surveys measure hypothetical commitment. Actual combat means accepting the possibility of death, enduring physical hardship, living in constant fear. Ukraine showed that popular resistance can be fierce and sustained, but Ukraine also had the experience of 2014's Russian annexation of Crimea as a warning. Taiwan has lived an abstract threat for so long that the transition from peace to war might be psychologically devastating. Civil defense attempts to bridge this gap through societal preparation. Taiwan looks to Scandinavian models, Sweden's total defense concept, Finland's comprehensive preparedness, where entire populations are trained and equipped for resistance. In theory, every Taiwanese citizen should know first aid, understand how to access emergency supplies, have plans for communication if networks fail. Air raid drills happen periodically, though they're often treated casually, almost as performance art rather than genuine preparation. Volunteer groups have formed, including indigenous mountain tribes whose warriors possess terrain knowledge and skills invaluable in guerrilla warfare. The psychological challenge is motivating participation without creating panic. Too little preparation, and society is brittle, vulnerable to collapse when crisis strikes. Too much, and you create a siege mentality that damages quality of life and economic productivity. Taiwan attempts to walk this line, balancing normalcy with readiness, an equilibrium that's probably impossible to sustain perfectly. Food and fuel stockpiles exist, but may be insufficient for prolonged blockade. Emergency communications have backup systems, but their reliability under sustained attack is unknown. Hospital surge capacity is planned but never tested at war-scale demands. The information war presents threats as insidious as missiles. China conducts influence operations across Taiwan's media landscape, social networks, and political discourse. Disinformation campaigns sow doubt about American commitment, exaggerate Taiwan's military weaknesses, promote pro-unification narratives. Taiwan's vulnerabilities are structural. An open society where speech is protected, linguistic access since both sides speak Mandarin, business elites with deep financial ties to the mainland who might prioritize stability over sovereignty. Countermeasures rely on resilience rather than control. Digital literacy programs teach citizens to identify manipulation. Fact-checking organizations rapidly debunk false claims. Media pluralism itself becomes a defense. When no single narrative dominates, propaganda must compete in a marketplace of ideas rather than monopolize attention. The historical parallel is Cold War Berlin, where West Berlin's population endured decades of psychological pressure from East Germany and the Soviet Union. What sustained morale wasn't propaganda, but lived experience of freedom contrasted against authoritarianism. Taiwan's strongest information warfare asset might simply be the reality of its democratic life versus China's surveillance state. Political cohesion remains uncertain. Taiwan's party divisions run deep. The Kuomintang, rooted in the original Chinese nationalist government that fled to Taiwan in 1949, historically favored engagement with Beijing and economic integration. The Democratic Progressive Party emerged from pro-independence movements and emphasizes Taiwanese identity distinct from China. In the 2024 presidential election, Lai Ching-te of the DPP won, continuing policies that Beijing views as moving toward formal independence. Whether these political differences would dissolve in crisis or deepen into internal conflict is unknowable. Would opposition politicians rally behind the government, or would some argue for negotiation as the lesser evil? The Ukraine parallel offers both hope and warning. President Volodymyr Zelensky's refusal to flee Kyiv when Russian forces approached galvanized Ukrainian resistance. His presence, his defiance, transformed him into a symbol that sustained morale through early defeats and ongoing hardship. Taiwan's leadership would need similar courage and charisma. But Ukraine also showed that unity isn't automatic. It's built through leadership choices, communication strategy, and the visceral experience of invasion, making abstract threats horrifyingly concrete. Taiwan won't know if it possesses this cohesion until tested, and by then it will be too late to build it. Economic stakeholders present another complication. Taiwan's business elites have invested billions in mainland China. Foxconn's founder built manufacturing empires in Shenzhen. Semiconductor executives maintain relationships with Chinese officials and customers. In conflict, these individuals face an impossible choice: support policies that might destroy their wealth or quietly advocate for accommodation. History suggests that economic interests rarely trump survival instincts when violence begins, but the period before violence, when deterrence might still work or fail, is precisely when these voices matter most. Are they a fifth column, or simply pragmatists trying to prevent catastrophe through engagement? The philosophical tension underlying all of this is democracy versus efficiency in crisis. Liberal democracies debate, dissent, argue. Authoritarian states command. In prolonged conflict, this creates advantages and disadvantages on both sides. Democracies can be slow to mobilize, but resilient once committed. Autocracies can act decisively but brittly, where failure has no release valve. Taiwan's political culture, vibrant, contentious, sometimes chaotic, reflects freedoms worth defending, but whether that culture can subordinate itself to military necessity without losing its essential character is an open question. Ultimately, Taiwan's survival depends not just on its own choices, but on calculations made in Beijing, Washington, Tokyo, and beyond. The Porcupine Strategy assumes rational actors who weigh costs against benefits. But what if rationality fails? American commitment to Taiwan exists in a state of deliberate ambiguity. Since the 1970s, when the United States recognized the PRC as China's legitimate government while maintaining unofficial relations with Taiwan, American policy has been strategic vagueness. The Taiwan Relations Act commits the U.S. to providing defensive weapons and maintaining capacity to resist coercion, but it doesn't explicitly promise military intervention. This ambiguity serves dual purposes. It deters China by leaving open the possibility of American involvement, while deterring Taiwan from provocative moves toward formal independence that might trigger conflict. Under President Biden, this ambiguity eroded. In multiple press conferences and interviews, Biden answered yes when asked if the U.S. would defend Taiwan militarily. Each time, administration officials walked back his statements, insisting policy hadn't changed. But the pattern suggested either a strategic shift toward clarity or, perhaps more concerning, confusion about what American policy actually is. Biden's comments might strengthen deterrence. Beijing cannot assume American non-intervention, or they might provoke preemptive action if Chinese leaders conclude that their window for achieving reunification is closing. Material American support is substantial. Arms sales total billions annually, including F-16V fighters, Harpoon missiles, and HIMARS rocket systems. American military trainers work with Taiwanese forces, though officially in civilian capacities. Intelligence sharing gives Taiwan advance warning of Chinese military movements. Forward-deployed American forces in Japan and Guam provide rapid response capability. Yet all of this stops short of the one thing that would actually guarantee Taiwan's defense: a formal defense treaty with Article 5-style commitments that attack on Taiwan equals attack on the United States. The credibility problem haunts American commitments. Afghanistan's chaotic withdrawal in 2021 shook allies' confidence worldwide. If America abandoned a 20-year investment rather than sustain casualties and expense, would it risk war with a nuclear-armed peer competitor over an island it doesn't formally recognize? Ukraine received weapons, intelligence, and economic support, but not American troops, even as Russian atrocities multiplied. Taiwan might receive similar aid, but aid without direct intervention leaves Taiwan fighting alone in the critical early days when Chinese forces would attempt to establish air and sea control. Economic interdependence complicates calculation. U.S.-China trade exceeds $700 billion annually. American companies depend on Chinese manufacturing. Chinese reserves are partly held in U.S. Treasury bonds. War would trigger global economic collapse, making the 2008 financial crisis look minor by comparison. Semiconductor dependency on Taiwan adds another dimension. Without TSMC's chips, American tech industry and military capabilities would face severe disruption. The cost of intervention is catastrophically high, but the cost of abandonment might be equally severe. Strategic calculus becomes a trolley problem with no good answer. Historical precedents offer grim lessons. In 1956, Hungarian revolutionaries rose against Soviet occupation, expecting Western support that never came. In 1968, the Prague Spring ended with Warsaw Pact tanks, while NATO watched. These were Cold War moments when superpowers had clear spheres of influence and understood that challenging them risked nuclear war. Taiwan exists in a more ambiguous position, neither clearly within American security architecture nor fully outside it. This ambiguity creates space for miscalculation on all sides. Regional actors add layers of complexity. Japan's geographic proximity, just 110 miles from Taiwan's Yonaguni Island, means conflict would inevitably affect Japanese territory. Okinawa hosts American bases critical to any Taiwan intervention. Chinese missiles targeting those bases would strike Japanese soil. The Senkaku Islands, disputed between Japan and China, sit in waters where naval battles might occur. Japan's calculus is stark. Taiwan's fall would leave Japan exposed to Chinese naval power in the East China Sea and threaten sea lanes carrying energy imports that Japan's economy depends on. Japanese rearmament, previously unthinkable due to post-World War II pacifist constitution, has accelerated. Defense spending is increasing toward NATO's 2% standard. Strike capability, offensive weapons previously prohibited, is being developed under the rationale of preemptive defense. Prime Minister Kishida's administration has taken positions on Taiwan that previous governments avoided, explicitly linking Taiwan's security to Japan's. Yet whether Japan would actually join American forces in Taiwan's defense remains uncertain. The pacifist culture is real, public opinion divided, and the constitutional barriers formidable. Australia, South Korea, and the Philippines share supply chain interests and alliance obligations, but face direct involvement questions. Australia's AUKUS partnership with Britain and the U.S. signals commitment to Indo-Pacific security, yet Australian public might balk at fighting a war in which they have no direct stake. South Korea's primary security concern is North Korea, and Seoul might calculate that neutrality in a Taiwan conflict keeps options open. The Philippines, despite historical alliance with the US and territorial disputes with China, has oscillated between confrontation and accommodation based on domestic politics. The Quad, US, Japan, India, Australia, and AUKUS represent loose coordination, not NATO-style collective defense. There's no Article 5 equivalent where attack on one means attack on all. Regional actors might provide intelligence, logistics, base access, but stop short of direct combat involvement. This creates a coalition of the concerned rather than a coalition of the committed, a distinction that matters enormously when missiles start flying. China's decision matrix is perhaps the most crucial and least transparent variable. Xi Jinping's rhetoric has sharpened. He has stated that reunification cannot be passed down generation after generation, implying that resolution must come during his tenure. Timelines circulate: 2027 matching PLA modernization goals, 2049 aligning with the People's Republic's centenary. Whether these are actual deadlines or aspirational targets, they create pressure points where action might seem necessary. Domestic Chinese imperatives are opaque to outside observers, but undeniably significant. The Communist Party's legitimacy rests partly on nationalism and the promise of restoring China's historical greatness, which explicitly includes Taiwan's return. Economic slowdown, youth unemployment, and demographic decline create stress that might make foreign adventure tempting as distraction or rallying point. Yet the party also fears the consequences of failure. A botched invasion wouldn't just lose military hardware. It could trigger internal crisis and regime collapse. Military confidence versus uncertainty presents a final consideration. The PLA has modernized impressively, but hasn't fought a major war since 1979's invasion of Vietnam, which ended badly for China. Amphibious operations are among the most complex military tasks, requiring coordination across naval, air, ground, and cyber domains under hostile fire. Taiwan's defenses, even if ultimately inadequate, would exact costs that are difficult to predict. Chinese military planners understand their own inexperience, but whether this caution outweighs political pressure is unknowable. Cost-benefit analysis from Beijing's perspective weighs several factors. Economic damage from sanctions and global recession would be severe. Casualty aversion matters in a society shaped by the one-child policy. Families with single sons might not tolerate mass conscription and battlefield deaths. International isolation could follow, though China's economic weight makes coordinated sanctions difficult. Most critically, failure would destroy Xi's political standing and possibly the party's rule. Success is therefore not optional if invasion is attempted. It must be overwhelming and rapid. Historical decision-making patterns offer clues, but not certainties. Mao's decision to intervene in the Korean War was risk-acceptant, willing to engage American forces despite material disadvantage. Deng Xiaoping's approach to Taiwan was patient, focused on economic integration and long-term trends favoring reunification. Xi Jinping's assertiveness, crushing Hong Kong's democracy, claiming the South China Sea, confronting India at Himalayan borders, suggests lower risk aversion than his predecessors. Whether this extends to gambling on Taiwan is the question that shapes the entire strategic environment. Scenarios range from incremental coercion to full invasion. A quarantine or blockade framed as customs enforcement could cut off Taiwan without triggering treaty obligations, testing American response while avoiding direct combat. Limited strikes seizing offshore islands like Kinmen or Matsu would demonstrate capability and will without the full cost of invading Taiwan proper. This salami-slicing approach gradually erodes Taiwan's position while staying below thresholds that might provoke intervention. Full invasion would be D-Day scale, requiring weather windows in April through May or October when the strait is calmest. Multi-domain coordination would begin with cyber attacks and missile strikes attempting to destroy Taiwan's defenses in opening hours. Amphibious forces would aim for rapid beachhead establishment before international response could organize. The fait accompli strategy assumes that if China can present the world with Taiwan's fall as an accomplished fact, economic interests and fear of escalation will lead to acceptance rather than reversal. And so Taiwan remains balanced on a knife's edge, armed with a strategy designed to make aggression unthinkable, yet knowing that history is littered with wars that should never have been fought. Deterrence is ultimately psychological, not just material. Classic deterrence theory assumes rational actors who calculate costs and benefits, then choose the option maximizing utility. But real humans don't function this way. We experience emotions, humiliation, pride, fear, anger, that cloud judgment. We fall prey to optimism bias, believing our plans will succeed despite historical evidence. We succumb to sunk cost fallacies, continuing failed policies because we've already invested so much. The Cuban Missile Crisis came within hours of nuclear war not because leaders were irrational, but because each side's rationality was bounded by incomplete information, domestic political pressure, and the unpredictable interactions of complex systems. Taiwan's Porcupine Strategy bets on cost imposition, creating rational deterrence. But what if Beijing concludes that national humiliation of Taiwan's continued separation outweighs economic damage? What if Chinese military commanders overestimate their capabilities, assuming they can achieve rapid victory before costs mount? What if American signals are misread, leading Beijing to believe intervention won't occur when it actually will, or vice versa? Deterrent stability requires not just capability but clear communication, and the signals between Washington, Beijing, and Taipei are anything but clear. The human cost of perpetual readiness weighs on Taiwan's society in ways difficult to quantify. Young conscripts train for urban warfare when they'd rather be starting careers. Business owners stockpile supplies they hope never to use. Parents explain to children why air raid drills matter, trying to balance honesty with reassurance. This is the existential burden of living under threat, not the acute terror of imminent danger, but the chronic stress of possibility, the mental space occupied by contingency planning for catastrophe. Philosophically, this raises questions that have haunted humanity since ancient times. What does it mean to live fully under the shadow of potential annihilation? The existentialists, Camus, Sartre, Heidegger, argued that confronting death's inevitability actually frees us to live authentically, to make choices that matter because we acknowledge our finitude. Taiwan's situation inverts this somewhat. Death isn't inevitable individual mortality, but potential collective destruction. Does this awareness deepen commitment to democratic values and shared community, or does it create paralysis and hedonistic short-termism? Perhaps both, in different people at different times. The semiconductor wildcard adds a dimension unique to the modern era. TSMC's centrality to global technology means Taiwan's fate is entangled with the world economy in unprecedented ways. The chips produced in Hsinchu and Tainan power everything from smartphones to artificial intelligence systems to military drones. China might calculate that destroying this capacity inflicts unacceptable economic pain on everyone, making intervention unlikely. Alternatively, as TSMC expands fabrication facilities in Arizona and Japan, geographic diversification might undermine Taiwan's strategic value. If advanced chips can be produced outside Taiwan, does the island lose its shield? The timeline of fab construction versus potential Chinese action creates a race with civilization-level stakes. Broader implications extend beyond Taiwan. The island serves as a test case for small state survival in a multipolar world where great powers compete and rules-based international order phrase. If Taiwan falls, what message does that send to the Baltics, to Eastern European NATO members, to South Korea? The return of territorial conquest, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, potential Chinese moves on Taiwan, challenges the optimistic 1990s assumption that military aggression between states was becoming obsolete. Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis, which suggested liberal democracy had won ideological competition, looks increasingly premature. Autocracies haven't abandoned expansionist ambitions, they've simply modernized their methods. The question of whether liberal democracies possess the will to defend themselves against determined autocracies is being tested in real time. Ukraine has shown that democracy can fight fiercely when invaded, but Ukraine also demonstrates limits. Western support is substantial, but calibrated to avoid escalation with Russia. Taiwan would face similar calculations at larger scale. Does the democratic world have the unity, the resolve, and the willingness to bear costs necessary to defend democracy's frontiers? Or will economic interests, war weariness, and domestic politics lead to accommodation and abandonment? The porcupine doesn't seek glory, only survival. It doesn't expand territory or punish adversaries. Its strategy is fundamentally conservative: maintain what exists, deter change through pain, hope that time and circumstance favor endurance. Taiwan's bet is that by making war too costly, war becomes impossible, or at least indefinitely delayed. This is a wager on rationality, on the assumption that even authoritarian regimes ultimately calculate costs and choose preservation over risky gambles. But the unanswered question persists: is deterrence stable or merely delaying the inevitable? Can a small democracy indefinitely resist a large autocracy's claim when that autocracy views reunification as historical destiny? Does time favor Taiwan through growing international support, deepening democracy, diverging identity, or does it favor China through military modernization, economic leverage, strategic patience? Return, finally, to those opening images. The night markets of Taipei, alive with vendors calling out specials and customers haggling over prices. The technology campuses where engineers design the next generation of processors that will power the world's devices. The bustling streets where young people debate politics with a freedom unavailable to their counterparts across the strait. Life continues, vibrant and complex and thoroughly normal. But beneath it, other preparations proceed. Tunnels are being dug into mountainsides to shelter command posts and supply depots. Missiles are being built in factories, then dispersed to hiding places along the coast. Young people cycle through military training, learning skills they hope never to use. The porcupine's quills are up, not in aggression, but in patient readiness. The world watches this small island, recognizing that its fate carries implications far beyond its shores. And history, as always, holds its breath, waiting to see whether deterrence holds or fails, whether the bet on cost imposition proves sufficient, whether the porcupine's ancient logic can survive in an age of missiles and microchips and great power ambition.